Hello and welcome. This evening we're going to look at the fact that a scramble for Africa is underway. This is not my term. It's being used by journalists and commentators from all over the world. Let's take a look.
Demographics is destiny. Within 4 years, Africa will have over 100 cities with more than a million inhabitants. By mid-century, the continent's total population will eclipse 2.4 billion. Africa will steadily displace the economies of East Asia as the leading destination for offshore manufacturing. Production and consumption will grow, while new value chains will be created in the process. Even now, foreign investors are constructing ports, railways, and highways across the continent. As a result, 3 new trans-Mediterranean corridors are emerging that will glue Europe and Africa. However, the configurations will have to traverse North Africa's gatekeepers, giving Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt the leverage to dictate terms. In this new scramble for Africa, it is as much about resources as control over corridors, for control is the source of strategic power. Over the past decade, an extraordinary wave of demographic and economic growth has swept across Africa. By 2050, urbanization will change the face of the continent. Metropolitan centers will be larger, more numerous, and better connected with the wider world. The cities will produce and consume more. Imports and exports will surge to meet demands. The political landscape is already adjusting to the idea. In 2018, the members of the African Union founded the African Continental Free Trade Area, bringing additional value to trans-African trade and commerce. Spanning 55 economies and a total GDP of $2.5 trillion, the African Continental Free Trade Area is now the world's largest trading bloc. In addition to promoting internal trade, new infrastructure, and the removal of import and export duties, the bloc also seeks to enhance the pre-existing value chains. Currently, the European Union holds a dominant position as Africa's largest trading partner. To put things into perspective, 36% of all African exports are bound for Europe, while the second largest partner, China, is the destination of only 9% of all African exports. At the same time, Europe is the source of 33% of imports, a stark contrast to the 5% of goods imported from China. In other words, in face of the growing competition in Africa, Europe remains the most important trading partner, and both Africa and Europe stand to gain a great deal from further cooperation. In a policy report by Germany's Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Professor Michael Tanhum highlights a series of Africa to Europe trade corridors that will reshape the interaction between the two continents. These corridors follow the trajectory of the Trans-African Highway system but are expanded by railways, ports, and possibly industrial zones. They are necessary for Africa's growth. More generally, they are necessary to improve commercial connectivity to consumer markets and a larger industrial manufacturing base. Trade corridors emerge in places where large investments in port, rail, and road infrastructure are coupled with an industrial base anchored in a manufacturing value chain. There are 3 such configurations going from Europe to Africa and vice versa. Control over these configurations will decide the geopolitical framework for years to come. Nowhere is this more evident than in North Africa, where the Trans-African highways connect with the Trans-Mediterranean nodes of Rabat, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Cairo. With a triple heritage of Arab, African, and Mediterranean culture, the North African nations stand as the gatekeepers of Africa. The collective pivot of the African corridors hinges entirely on the northern portion of the continent. Such a position endows Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt with a once-in-a-generation opportunity to cultivate partnerships on favorable terms and in doing so remake North Africa in their image. To the west, Morocco hosts the Atlantic Corridor. Part of Rabat's allure stems from the considerable investments in transportation infrastructure and industrial base. For instance, the French-financed El Borak high-speed railway links the commercial heart of Casablanca to the industrial port city of Tangier. Here, the recently completed Tangier Med Port reigns supreme as the Mediterranean's largest port. Goods and commodities coming as far afield as Senegal are exported from the Tangier Med Port. From Tangier, cargo vessels carry the goods a mere 45 kilometers north to Algeciras, the largest port in Spain, and a vital point of entry into the European market. From the Spanish port, the corridors travel north into France and Germany. Interestingly, in 2019, a major French automobile conglomerate opened a manufacturing plant north of Rabat to make use of the high-speed railway to Tangier port. Since then, Morocco has emerged as Africa's leading auto manufacturer. It is this type of smart infrastructure investments that will determine the success of the Atlantic corridor. France has been the leading investor in Morocco, but a stream of newfound private and public investors has flocked to the country in recent years, raising the strategic bar. There is now competition from Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and Arab Gulf patrons in addition to the French. Each investor is making more grand promises than the other. For instance, China is building a $10 billion high-tech industrial zone known as Tangier Tech City. Russia is constructing new oil refineries, and there is a plan to expand the high-speed rail infrastructure as far as La Guira by 2040. For its proximity and available infrastructure, Morocco is often dubbed as the door to the Sahara. However, the greatest challenge in the Atlantic corridor is the dispute in Western Sahara. The town of La Guira, for instance, currently lies in ruins, and separatist forces control the nearby areas. So, to realize its commercial corridor, Rabat needs to restore its sovereignty over the occupied territories. In this context, Washington's recent recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara is a crucial turning point. It also explains the recent clashes in Western Sahara. Further east lies the Maghreb corridor. Beginning at the terminus of Scandinavian Mediterranean corridor in Taranto, Italy, the Maghreb corridor extends southward through Malta and into Tunisia. From there, the corridor links by highway to Algiers before traversing the Sahara and reaching as far south as Lagos, Nigeria. Alternatively, the Tunisian corridor flows along the coast, crossing into Libya and then continuing more than 2,300 kilometers south to N'Djamena, Chad. Facilitating the flow of trade are several key developments. In July 2020, the Turkey-Italy-Tunisia multi-module transportation route began operating across the center of the Mediterranean. As a symbiosis of Turkish and Italian interests, the maritime arc connects the Maghreb region to southern Europe and the Black Sea. The corridor's central hub is Italy's deep-sea port of Taranto, which recently underwent a $480 million renovation and is operated by a Turkish firm. Meanwhile, Chinese firms are commissioned to construct a new commercial port in Chechel, Algeria, and the African Union and the African Development Bank are currently considering further enhancing the Trans-African Highway network to increase the operability of the land routes. Italian and Chinese firms stand a good chance to win additional contracts in Algeria, while Turkish firms are likely to gain commissions in Libya. What makes the Maghreb corridor stand out is its versatility. It involves a number of major powers, and it's the only corridor going into Nigeria, a nation that will double its population to 400 million by 2050. Yet here too, the Maghreb corridor faces numerous complications. While Tunisia stands as a beacon of stability, the corridor needs both Algeria and Libya to work. Libya is the real problem. The ongoing conflict there has created a degree of unpredictability which inhibits business. However, change is within scope. The arrival of Turkish troops in Libya and their support for the international government in Tripoli has guaranteed Ankara a strategic beachhead in the Maghreb. This then explains the strategic value of Libya and the numerous foreign interventions there. Interestingly, 1 month after the Turkish intervention, Algerian and Turkish lawmakers signed a trade agreement pledging to raise bilateral trade to $5 billion. At the same time, China and Algeria have agreed to deepen the latter's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. So while the immediate road ahead is difficult, unstoppable long-term plans are in the making. To the east, Egypt, with its colossal population and ample energy supplies, stands as the final Africa to Europe corridor. Straddling the Mediterranean, the Egyptian corridor connects Central and East Europe through the Greek port city of Piraeus to the economies of East Africa. Its total length is more than 10,000 kilometers, measured from Cairo, Egypt to Cape Town, South Africa. To make the corridor commercially viable, Cairo is looking to expand its total container capacity. Beijing and Moscow have rushed to meet demand. Chinese and Russian firms are expanding the existing ports at Damietta, East Said Port, and a new container terminal is planned for construction at Abu Qir. Russia and China's close relationship with the Egyptian government serves a dual purpose, as a strategic and commercial foothold in the region. Also notable are the Emirati plans to expand Egypt's ports by the Red Sea. Port Shokna, for instance, is currently undergoing a $520 million expansion. The main complication in the Egyptian corridor sits outside of Egypt. Though Cairo is making impressive steps to expand its container capacity, East Africa's existing infrastructure is insufficient to form a commercial corridor. For example, the ports in Mogadishu and Mombasa can handle the cargo, but they are poorly connected with the booming inland economies of East Africa. Hence, the African segment of the corridor must foremost improve and expand its rail and road connectivity. Funded by Kuwaiti subsidiaries, modern rail infrastructure is currently under development to enhance transportation connectivity between Egypt and Sudan, but similar investments are necessary in the south of the continent. This will not be easy. In Ethiopia, through which the Cairo-Cape Town highway passes, there is an ethnic insurgency by the Tigray region. Also, Egypt is in a stalemate with Ethiopia over the latter's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile River. These conflicts need resolution if the Egyptian corridor is to be viable. That said, it's also possible that Egypt avoids Ethiopia entirely by steering the commercial corridor towards the White Nile countries with whom it has better relations. This is very much a process in the making. All in all, Africa is changing, some areas more rapidly than others, depending on factors such as demographics, economics, politics, and geography. Places that were previously neglected are now dominating geopolitical agendas. There is a window of opportunity in Africa, especially in the north. Though Europe remains Africa's largest trading partner, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and Arab Gulf patrons are filling the geopolitical vacuum. The scramble for Africa will play out for years to come.
Well, we're told by this commentator that there's a window of opportunity in Africa, especially in the north. Though Europe remains Africa's largest trading partner, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and Arab Gulf patrons are filling the geopolitical vacuum. Well, this is a remarkably uninformed and rather ignorant statement. On the one hand, what is the political vacuum in Africa? There are countries here, there are people here, there are governments here. What's the vacuum? And what's this window of opportunity? He's speaking about it as if it's the first time. In fact, the scramble for Africa is quite old. And he makes no reference to the fact that it's been well worn as a concept for years. He refers to it as a kind of new opportunity. There is a window of opportunity in Africa. Once again, one might add, yes, a scramble once again. Because this was not the first scramble for Africa. It was a very famous one that took place about 150 years ago, 140 some years ago, at a conference in Berlin, in Europe. What happened? As a result of the previous scramble for Africa on the part of Europeans in the late 19th century. Well, as it turns out, historians have looked at this in great detail. People like Basil Davidson, a historian of Africa, has studied this very carefully. And he put out a short film about it that's worth looking at. The whole film is called Africa. It was written and presented by Basil Davidson, and one of the episodes of it was entitled "This Magnificent African Cake," a quote from one of the participants in the first scramble for Africa. Let's look at a small portion of episode 6, which he deals with the question of the first scramble, what its origins were, what its character was, and what its aftermath was. Take a look.
west coast of Africa, looking today much as it did 100 years ago. At that time, the old evils of the slave trade had become a distant, though disgraceful, memory. But there now opened a new chapter of confrontation along these tropical shores. In past years, Europeans had come here for profitable business. Now they wanted more, much more. Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the black continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufactures, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget. Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack, and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain, but now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement. In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege. The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British, but this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile. But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself. To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort at Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive. Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance, until finally the governor and his wife got away to the coast and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast. All over Africa, the new military technology of automatic guns gave easy victories to the invaders. Countless resistors died. Many thousands at the single battle of Omdurman in Britain's conquest of the Sudan. Meanwhile, in another part of the Sudan, the French were also scoring victories. For the most part, public opinion rejoiced. For were these not victories over an inferior species, a kind of joke humanity? There were some critics, but not many, and their voice was ignored or silenced. What really mattered was to do down one's European rivals. If you were British, to get the better of the French in West Africa or of the Germans in East Africa, while orphans like little Uganda were left on the protective doorstep of Father Don Bull. Even before 1900, there came a new source of conflict: settlers from Europe, French in the far north, Dutch and then British in the far south, and some Germans. Other settlers were attracted to the good farming land of the east to Tanganyika, northern and southern Rhodesia, and the British territories of Uganda and Kenya. Once again, nobody asked permission. An early French governor had laid down the golden rule. Wherever good water and fertile land are found, he said, settlers must be installed without questioning whose land it may be. The settlers, not surprisingly, agreed. The next step in East Africa was to build a railway from the coast to the interior. The line was completed in 1901, and millions of acres of good farming land in Kenya were opened to white ownership and settlement for the buying price of next to nothing. These white strangers, oddly enough, were at first welcomed by the African inhabitants. But the welcome didn't last for long, for they soon discovered that colonial government put them above all their land and their labour. These colonial demands provoked a repeated resistance, and against that resistance, the colonial government, with white settlers arriving in ever larger numbers from Britain, waged a war with little mercy, and of course, with rifles and machine guns against spears and arrows.
So, a scramble for Africa is underway once again. And in fact, our first commentator wasn't the first one to point this out. The Economist, in an article a while back, underscored that the new scramble for Africa is underway and actually wrote an article indicating that it was beneficial, potentially, for Africa. As you can see, the new scramble for Africa and how Africa can win it. Let's take a look at the Economist's version of this scramble. They seem at least to have understood that there was a history behind the word scramble for Africa. In fact, they offer a threefold understanding. First, the 19th century scramble, then a scramble in the middle of the 20th century, and now a third wave of a scramble, according to them.
The first scramble for Africa was when European colonial powers saw a continent that was vast, rich in minerals and land, and very poorly defended, and they rushed in to carve it up and steal the land. The second was during the Cold War, when East and West were locked in a struggle for global domination. That's when the Soviet Union backed Marxist despots all over Africa, and the Americans backed any leader who said that he was in favor of capitalism. The third wave, which is happening right now, is much more benign. It's much more about voluntary exchange, about trade, and about the spread of technology. It's a new kind of scramble for Africa, which, if handled well, Africans can win. The old stereotype of foreigners in Africa is that they're only interested in the minerals and not Africa's people. That's still sometimes true, and there are still a lot of corrupt mineral deals going on in Africa. But much more important now is African people. There'll be more Africans in the world than Chinese people by 2025. It's a huge market, and since they're all living in independent countries, they're in a much better position than in the past to negotiate better deals with the outside world. And this has been great for Africans. Greater openness to trade and investment from the outside world is one of the reasons why Africans are 2/5 richer than they were in 2000. Of course, the fact that there are fewer wars and better macroeconomic policies has also helped. There's still a big problem with corruption. Unaccountable leaders in the less transparent African countries can often sign deals with outsiders that benefit them personally, but perhaps not their country so much. The things that Russia's doing in the Central African Republic, where you have private firms protecting diamond mines and the president of that war-torn country, are to many people reminiscent of what happened in the 19th century at the height of imperialism. The scale of foreign interest is unprecedented. Between 2010 and 2016, 320 new embassies were opened in Africa, probably the largest embassy building boom anywhere, ever. Turkey alone opened 26. Last year, India announced it was going to open 18. Military links are spreading too. China alone has ties with 45 African countries. America and France are helping defeat terrorists in the Sahel. Oil-rich Arab nations are setting up military bases in the Gulf, and Russia has military deals with 19 African countries. African voters and watchdogs need to insist on more transparency in the way that these deals are done. The kind of work that Kenyan journalists have done to expose scandals connected to a Chinese railway project is very encouraging. Second, African leaders need to think more strategically. China is one country, Africa's 54. It's going to be much harder for them to drive the right kind of bargains if they let China negotiate with them individually behind closed doors. Even if African unity is a bit of a far-off dream at the moment, at least you could see more regional unity, which would be very useful in negotiating infrastructure projects. Finally, Africans should take what some of their new friends tell them with a pinch of salt. The Chinese government is very keen to tell Africans that democracy is a Western idea and that development needs a firm hand. This may be music to the ears of some of the strongmen on the continent, but African voters should not be fooled by it. There's a lot of research out there suggesting that the African countries that are more democratic tend to grow faster and prosper better. As the population gets more educated and moves into the cities more, we're seeing that they're more critical of governments and giving the ruling party a lower share of the vote. As African politics grows more competitive, voters will have more clout, and they'll be able to insist on a form of globalization that works for Africans and foreigners alike.
Well, a scramble for Africa is underway, according to the Economist, but in effect, they're posing the question how Africans can win it. And that's an interesting formulation. They're very much more optimistic about this wave of the scramble than those who are aware of the first scramble, or what they call the first scramble in the 1880s. There are some empty questions, though, when you look at their title in detail. What is this new scramble? What's new about it? And how are Africans going to be able to win it? What does it mean to win a scramble for your own country? These are questions that need to be asked in detail, especially because the new scramble for Africa means the investment, according to these authorities, in greater and greater infrastructure for extraction from the African continent, and perhaps for the conversion of their agricultural systems to new forms of petro-intensive cultivation, something which has been underscored as a mistake for decades now.